8. ZIL 4904 screw-propelled vehicle. During World War II, military sought alternative ways to travel, something different than the typical wheeled vehicle, but they didn't create anything that went into widespread use. The Soviet Union revisited this idea during the Cold War and developed an amphibious vehicle. It operates by being propelled forward on giant twisting screws, enabling it to move efficiently along terrain like snow and swampland. There were a few reasons for wanting to travel in these types of environments. A main one at the time was because Russian astronauts often landed in marshy environments on their return to Earth. But the design wasn't as beneficial as the designers hoped, and only a handful of screw-propelled vehicles were built. Very little footage and information are publicly available about the machines, but in 2017, we got a rare look at one in action. A mechanical expert named Alexei Anakin bought one of the bizarre vehicles and restored it with the help of his crew. By the time he was driving it on camera in the water and across the ground, it looked brand new, and it seemed to traverse the landscape with ease. Other screw-propelled vehicles like the ZIL 4904 are inoperable and probably rusting away somewhere, most likely alongside a collection of other Soviet-era vehicles. Developed in 1972, the ZIL 4904 was the Soviet Union's second screw-propelled vehicle and the country's largest machine like it. Today, the ZIL sits in a junkyard as a decaying reminder of ambitious and creative innovations the Cold War brought into the world. 7. Spain's NASA satellites. Located near Madrid, Spain, the Buitrago de la Zoya Satellite Communications Center started operating in 1970. The property consisted of 4 massive 100-foot-high satellite dishes, which were part of NASA's Manned Spaceflight Network, or the MSFN. They were mainly used for monitoring the communications of American space missions. Buitrago was one of the 3 stations throughout Spain that were used for similar purposes. They made up a much larger communication system called the Deep Space Network, which remains in service to this day with locations in Spain, Australia, and California. The stations in Spain supported NASA's famous Apollo program, which put a man on the moon for the first time in 1969, and other historic missions. In 2003, the Buitrago de la Zoya site shut down, and the telecommunications company that once serviced it transferred its operations somewhere else. The humongous satellite antennas remain outside the abandoned station today, pointed up at the sky as years of neglect slowly take a toll on their appearance. NASA still operates a global communications network, and one station in Spain remains active. Known as the Madrid Deep Space Communication Complex, or MDSCC, it was built in 1964, a few years before Buitrago. At first glance, it looks strikingly similar to the abandoned site, with the only striking difference between the properties being the condition of the satellites. In addition to monitoring communication activity, employees participate in radio astronomy research using highly sensitive telescopes created with help from the satellites. 6. Convair B36 Peacemaker. Developed for the U.S. Army Air Force after World War II, the Convair B36 Peacemaker went into service in 1948 as a strategic bomber and part of the American Nuclear Deterrent Force. With a wingspan of 230 feet and propellers measuring 19 feet long, it was impossible to miss in the sky. The massive aircraft was powered by 6 backward-mounted radial engines and 4 extra jet engines for additional thrust, giving it an imposing and unusual appearance. Almost immediately, the B-36 landed at the center of a dispute between the United States Army and Navy. The Navy saw the newly created Air Force as a threat to its role as the primary defender of the country's coastline and took its frustrations out on the B-36, describing it as a billion-dollar blunder and a lumbering cow. While its critics failed to end its career as early as they wanted, the B-36 only remained in service for 11 years before it was retired in 1959 when the B-52 Stratofortress came into play. Out of the 383 Peacemakers built, only 4 complete examples remain today. They're on display at museums in Ohio, Arizona, Nebraska, and California. While the B-36 never saw actual combat, broke any impressive records, or did anything particularly remarkable, it served its intended purpose and was remembered for its distinctive appearance and large size. What would you do if you found a strange abandoned aircraft? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. 5. the Northrop Tact Blue. The U.S. military began working on developing stealth technology in the late 1970s. As part of these top-secret efforts, they produced several aircraft prototypes. One of the earliest experimental vehicles was called the Northrop Tact Blue. It was designed in the early 1980s with the goal of proving a plane could fly over and behind battlefields at low altitudes without being picked up by enemy radar. The Tact Blue met this requirement and was capable of closely monitoring enemy forces, even through clouds, while remaining undetected. It was equipped with sensors that transmitted information to ground command centers in real time without giving the aircraft's location away, marking an important development in technology's stealth capabilities. Nicknamed the Whale and the Alien School Bus for its distinct rounded rectangular shape, the Tact Blue was kept secret from the public for years after undergoing its first test flight at Area 51. After 135 flights and logging 250 flying hours over a 3-year period, the experimental jet was put into storage during 1985. The details of the project were declassified almost a decade later in 1996. That same year, the prototype was put on display in the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. The Tact Blue may not seem like it was successful, since it never surpassed the prototype stage and was only flown for 3 years, but it marked an important step in the development of future stealth bombers and influenced the design of the Northrop Grumman B-2 Spirit, which first took to the skies in 1989 and remains in service to this day. 4. Winslow Junction Train Graveyard. It's not unusual to spot a few abandoned trains parked along some old tracks, but there's something particularly creepy about the Winslow Junction Train Graveyard in New Jersey's Pine Barrens, and the site's history makes it even more unsettling. Located roughly halfway between Philadelphia and Atlantic City, Winslow Junction used to be one of the world's busiest railway junctions in the early 20th century. At a time when car travel was still new, people relied on trains to get to and from the Jersey Shore and other destinations. After all, it was one of the country's most bustling regions at the time. Late one night in July of 1992, a passenger train called the Midnight Flyer sped through an open switch at the junction at 90 miles per hour and derailed, sending train cars tumbling down a nearby embankment. 7 people were killed and 89 others were injured in the crash. Over the next couple of decades, train ridership decreased as car travel became more and more popular. By the 1960s, service along the line had been reduced from twice daily to less than 6 times a week, and it stopped altogether during the 1980s. The once bustling station was abandoned and turned into a storage space for a half-dozen decommissioned rail cars, which remain parked to this day. Since then, Mother Nature has begun reclaiming the property as the cars waste away. One brightly colored rail car bearing a red, yellow, and powder blue design stands out among the rest. An orange locomotive still bears the lettering of Southern Railroad Company, one of the 2 competing companies that offered service on the line. Some of the cars look older or more damaged than others, and others are covered in graffiti. Footage shared by explorers shows the interior in complete filth, covered with trash. Filled with old bunk beds, a bar lined with stools, dining tables, and other fixtures that once accommodated travelers, the decaying relics tell the story of a once thriving era despite their current state. 3. Martini Beriev VVA-14. Throughout the Cold War, the Soviet Union experimented with amphibious and vertical takeoff vehicles. One of their most bizarre creations was called the Martini Beriev VVA-14. It was capable of flying at high altitudes and hovering just above the water surface using an aerodynamic ground effect. Its intended purpose was to destroy U.S. Navy submarines. The first prototype was finished and made its maiden flight in 1972. It was fitted with 14 engines, but was never given the lifting engines originally in the plans that would have increased the chance of making vertical takeoffs. Instead, its designer Robert Martini turned it into an ekranoplan, giving it the ability to glide extremely close to the water like a hovercraft. The VVA-14 had a strange appearance and has been described as a dragon with 3 heads when it flies. It was also fitted with pontoons, which made it look even more off. The military improved the development of the VVA-14 for another 2 years until Martini's death. He had worked hard to keep the project going, and without his continued push, it was no longer a big priority. The project slowly came to a halt and was abandoned entirely. Only 2 prototypes were ever finished, and just one of them survives today. It's been sitting outside the Soviet Central Air Force Museum in Moscow since 1987 in a broken state. The VVA-14 helped influence the continued development of ekranoplans, and the Soviet Union became the undisputed leader in that field. But these vehicles came with disadvantages, including flying conditions that required completely calm seas. They were also extremely expensive to build, and the Soviet Union eventually abandoned the concept. 2. Avro Canada VZ9 Avro Car. During the 1950s, Avro Canada began working with the US government in a top-secret development project to create a vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, or VTOL, that was capable of flying at high speeds and altitudes. A handful of flying saucer-like vehicles were made as a part of the project, which called for a disc-shaped aircraft that had both hovercraft capabilities and the ability to fly in a more conventional and typical fashion. The most successful version out of these was the Avro Car. 2 prototypes were built. The first performed well in some ways during testing, but was aerodynamically unstable and ultimately lacked the control it needed for high-speed flight. The second prototype couldn't fly more than a few feet off the ground without starting to pitch and roll uncontrollably. Its exhaust also produced a loud screaming noise, which posed a problem for stealth. The Avro Car project was very expensive and received varying amounts of support and skepticism from branches of the US military, but it had enough hope and funding to continue for a handful of years. In 1959, Avro Canada laid off many special projects employees and restructured its remaining staff members. Development of the Avro Car continued for another few years until money ran out, at which point the military agreed to cancel the program. Officials encouraged the further development of VTOL vehicles, but that never became a reality. The first Avro Car prototype sat in storage for 40 years before undergoing restoration. It's now on permanent display at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. 1. The Aviatika MAI-890. Designed by the Moscow Aviation Institute in the 1980s, the Aviatika MAI-890 started out as an experimental aircraft that could perform a variety of tasks, including training flights, patrols, aerial surveys, and more. It proved to be extremely versatile, leading to further development as a multi-purpose aircraft. Production of the ultralight biplane got its start in 1991 and continues today. The MAI-890 is extremely small, measuring only 17.4 feet long and 7.4 feet high. It was originally developed as a single-seater with barely enough room to squeeze one pilot inside. A two-seater version was eventually made, as well as a variant designed for spraying crops. All versions of the plane are small, with an empty weight of just 450 pounds. Despite its tiny size and fragile appearance, the MAI-890 is known for its maneuverability and is often used for performing aerobatic displays. Although the plane has been around for more than 30 years, it still seems to be growing in popularity. Of the more than 300 that have been sold, about 50 are registered to owners in Europe and South Africa. Recently, a group of adventurers who run the Russian urban exploration website discovered a decommissioned parts workshop one night on the grounds of a partially abandoned aviation plant in Moscow. Inside, they found some aircraft that were deserted in various stages of production, including a few MAI-890s. Back when it was still in operation, the factory made parts for experimental planes. It's unclear why the MAI-890s were left behind without being finished, but it's possible a larger facility took over its production after it was fully greenlighted for the consumer market. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and make sure you subscribe. We'll see you next time.